On January 13, 2026, intelligence reports began circulating through Western defense ministries. The details were fragmented, but the pattern unmistakable. Burkina Faso's Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Russia's Ministry of Defense, and Iranian Revolutionary Guard commanders were coordinating something far more significant than diplomatic pleasantries. This wasn't another symbolic handshake or a vague partnership agreement. This was operational. And if the emerging contours of this alliance solidify, the global security architecture could fracture in ways not seen since the Cold War. For the past 2 years, Traoré has systematically dismantled Burkina Faso's ties with France, expelled foreign troops, and invited Russian military instructors into Ouagadougou. But this goes further. What's being constructed now isn't just a bilateral defense relationship. It's a triangular security axis linking the Sahel, the Kremlin, and Tehran, three powers who share one strategic priority: reducing Western influence by any means necessary. Russia brings battlefield experience, Wagner-style paramilitaries, and advanced air defense systems. Iran offers drone technology, asymmetric warfare expertise, and a well-oiled sanctions evasion network. Traoré provides something equally valuable: geographic access. Burkina Faso sits at the crossroads of West Africa, bordered by 6 countries, several of which are already experiencing democratic backsliding and anti-French sentiment. If this axis takes root, it doesn't just threaten French interests in the Sahel. It threatens the entire post-colonial order that has governed African security partnerships for over 6 decades. The implications stretch far beyond Africa. A formalized security bloc between these 3 actors would fragment Western focus across multiple theaters simultaneously. NATO is already stretched thin managing the war in Ukraine and rising tensions in the South China Sea. Now imagine Russian and Iranian military advisors embedded in the Sahel, coordinating intelligence, training local militias, and providing anti-aircraft systems to governments hostile to Western intervention. France can't deploy troops into hostile airspace without severe risk. The United States loses a critical node in its counter-terrorism architecture. Regional allies like Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire are forced to recalculate their own alignments. This is strategic encirclement in reverse. For years, Russia and Iran have complained about NATO expansion and Western military presence in their peripheries. Now they're doing the exact same thing, but in regions where Western power has historically gone unchallenged. The Sahel becomes a second front. The Middle East remains contested. Eastern Europe stays militarized. And suddenly, the West is playing defense on 3 continents at once. But here's where the situation becomes even more volatile. Traoré isn't just any military leader. He's 36 years old, commands genuine popular support, and has framed his entire political identity around sovereignty and anti-imperialism. He's not a puppet. He's an ideologue with regional ambitions. If he successfully models an alternative security partnership, one that doesn't rely on Western funding or conditional aid, other Sahelian leaders will take notice. Mali and Niger have already moved in similar directions. Guinea, Chad, and even parts of the Central African Republic are watching closely. Western diplomats are no longer returning phone calls from Paris. Military bases that once coordinated counterterrorism operations across the Sahel are being dismantled, their personnel given weeks to leave. French flags are being torn down in public squares from Bamako to Ouagadougou, replaced by Russian tricolors and portraits of leaders who've built their legitimacy on one simple message: the West had its chance, and it failed. If Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré formalizes a strategic partnership with Russia and Iran, it won't just be another diplomatic realignment. It will be the final confirmation that Western influence in Africa is collapsing faster than anyone in Washington or Paris is willing to admit. For decades, France maintained a sprawling security presence across its former colonies, justified under the banner of counterterrorism and stability. The United States followed with drone bases, training missions, and intelligence-sharing agreements designed to counter jihadist insurgencies. But the results on the ground tell a different story. Despite billions in military aid and thousands of troops deployed, jihadist violence has only intensified. Civilian casualties have mounted. Governments have grown weaker, not stronger. And across the Sahel, a dangerous narrative has taken hold. Western intervention doesn't solve problems, it perpetuates them. Traore didn't invent this sentiment. He's riding it. When he came to power through a military coup in 2022, he immediately began dismantling the Franco-African security framework that had governed Burkina Faso since independence. French troops were expelled. Military cooperation agreements were suspended. And in their place, Russian instructors arrived. Iranian drones were reportedly sighted. And a new security doctrine emerged. One that prioritizes sovereignty over partnership and self-reliance over dependence. This is where the stakes become clear. If Burkina Faso successfully positions Russia and Iran as viable alternative security partners, other African governments will take notice. Mali has already moved in this direction, inviting Wagner Group forces and severing ties with France. Niger followed after its own coup in 2023, demanding the withdrawal of U.S. troops and exploring Russian military support. Chad, long considered one of France's most reliable allies in the region, has begun publicly questioning the value of its relationship with Paris. The dominoes are falling, and each one makes the next collapse more likely. What's driving this shift isn't just anti-Western rhetoric. It's a cold calculation about effectiveness. Russia doesn't lecture African governments about human rights. Iran doesn't impose conditionality on its military support. They offer weapons, training, and political cover without the baggage of colonial history or the scrutiny of liberal democratic norms. For leaders like Traore, who face existential security threats and restless populations demanding results, that's an attractive proposition. But here's the deeper concern for Western policymakers. This isn't just about losing military bases or diplomatic influence in a single region. The Sahel sits at the intersection of critical global pathways, migration routes into Europe, energy corridors, rare earth mineral deposits, and ideological battlegrounds where jihadist networks recruit and expand. If Western powers lose their foothold here, they lose their ability to shape outcomes across an entire continent. France loses its post-colonial leverage. The United States loses intelligence access and forward operating capability. NATO loses strategic depth in a region that increasingly matters for European security. And the alternative isn't neutrality. It's alignment with powers actively hostile to Western interests. Russia gains a geographic wedge into West Africa, complicating French and American operations across multiple theaters. Iran extends its reach beyond the Middle East, opening new fronts for asymmetric pressure and sanctions evasion. Together, they create a security architecture that explicitly excludes Western participation and explicitly challenges Western primacy. Local populations may not see this as a loss. Many view Western military presence as a source of instability rather than security, an occupying force rather than a protective partner. If Russia and Iran can deliver tangible results, if they can reduce jihadist violence or provide economic opportunities that Western aid never materialized, then the legitimacy balance shifts entirely. The West doesn't just lose influence. It loses the moral argument. Uranium convoys rolling through the desert from Niger into Burkina Faso no longer report to Western mining companies. They report to Moscow. The lithium deposits scattered across the Sahel, essential for electric vehicle batteries and renewable energy storage, are being surveyed by Chinese and Russian geologists, not European ones. And the pipelines that once guaranteed energy flow from West Africa into European markets are now subject to the political whims of governments aligned with Iran and Russia. If Ibrahim Traoré consolidates a strategic partnership with Moscow and Tehran, the consequences won't just be diplomatic. They'll be economic, industrial, and existential for Western supply chains that have taken decades to build. This isn't abstract geopolitics. This is about the physical materials that power modern civilization. Burkina Faso sits in a region that holds some of the world's most critical resources. uranium for nuclear reactors, gold for financial reserves, manganese for steel production, and rare earth minerals essential for semiconductors, military hardware, and green energy infrastructure. For years, Western corporations extracted these resources under favorable agreements negotiated with compliant governments. Those agreements are now being torn up. Traore has made it clear that resource sovereignty is non-negotiable. Since taking power, he's renegotiated mining contracts, increased state ownership stakes, and openly courted alternative partners willing to offer better terms. Russia's state-owned mining conglomerates have stepped in with offers that don't come with human rights conditionality or environmental oversight requirements. Iran, already experienced in navigating sanctions and building alternative trade networks, provides logistical expertise and financial channels that bypass Western banking systems entirely. Together, they're constructing a parallel resource economy that operates outside Western control. The implications are staggering. France imports roughly 25% of its uranium from Niger, Burkina Faso's neighbor and ally in this emerging anti-Western bloc. If that supply is disrupted or redirected toward Russia and China, French nuclear reactors face fuel shortages. Germany's renewable energy transition depends on rare earth minerals, increasingly controlled by governments hostile to Berlin's foreign policy. The United States military relies on cobalt and lithium for advanced weapon systems, electric military vehicles, and next-generation defense technology. If these materials flow exclusively through Moscow and Tehran, Western defense industries lose strategic autonomy. This is where the stakes become clear. Resource control isn't just about profit margins or trade balances. It's about leverage. A Russia-Iran Traore axis positioned around critical supply chains can dictate terms, raise prices, and selectively restrict access based on political compliance. European governments, already struggling with energy security after cutting ties with Russian gas, would face a second resource crisis, this time in minerals they can't easily replace. Sanctions become less effective when the sanctioned powers control the materials needed to build the technologies enforcing those sanctions. And the economic disruption doesn't stop at borders. Global markets react to supply uncertainty. If Western companies can no longer guarantee stable access to Sahelian uranium or lithium, prices spike. Industries dependent on predictable supply chains, renewable energy sectors, automotive manufacturers, tech companies, face cost increases that get passed down to consumers. Inflation rises, political pressure mounts, and suddenly domestic economic stability in Western democracies becomes vulnerable to decisions made in Ouagadougou, Moscow, and Tehran. But there's a deeper strategic concern. Western military and technological superiority has always rested on an assumption: unrestricted access to the resources needed to sustain it. Rare earth minerals for precision-guided missiles, cobalt for drone batteries, uranium for naval reactors. If hostile powers corner these markets, they don't need to match Western military capability directly. They just need to choke the supply lines that make that capability possible. Traore understands this. So do his partners in Moscow and Tehran. They're not just building a political alliance. They're constructing an economic counter-system designed to undermine the material foundations of Western power. Whether they can sustain it long-term remains uncertain. Resource diplomacy is fragile, vulnerable to internal corruption, shifting alliances, and market competition. But the fact that it's even being attempted signals a fundamental shift in how power is contested in the 21st century. NATO commanders are now gaming out scenarios they haven't had to consider since the height of the Cold War. What happens when the alliance is forced to defend on 3 continents simultaneously? Eastern Europe remains militarized, the Middle East grows more hostile, and now the Sahel is becoming a zone of active contestation where Russian and Iranian forces operate with impunity. If Ibrahim Traoré's Burkina Faso formalizes a strategic bloc with Moscow and Tehran, it won't just add another crisis point to the map. It will fundamentally alter the global distribution of power in ways that could unravel decades of Western dominance across military, economic, and ideological spheres. The architecture of post-Cold War security was built on a simple assumption. NATO and its allies could project power globally without facing coordinated, multi-front resistance. That assumption is collapsing. Russia's war in Ukraine has already stretched NATO's military resources and political cohesion to levels not seen in a generation. Now imagine Iranian forces, emboldened by a strategic partnership that extends their reach into West Africa, escalating tensions across the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the Horn of Africa. Add a Russian-backed Burkina Faso coordinating with Mali and Niger to deny Western access across the Sahel. Suddenly, NATO isn't just managing one theater. It's trying to respond to synchronized pressure from Moscow, Tehran, and Ouagadougou, each exploiting the other's moves to maximize Western overstretch. This is strategic encirclement on a global scale. In Eastern Europe, NATO forces remain committed to deterring further Russian aggression, a mission that requires sustained troop presence, advanced weaponry, and constant readiness. In the Middle East, Iran has spent years building proxy networks across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, each capable of disrupting Western interests or threatening key allies like Israel and Saudi Arabia. Now, if Tehran gains a foothold in the Sahel through partnership with Traore, it opens an entirely new front where Western militaries are already weakened and where public opinion has turned decisively against foreign intervention. The economic implications are just as severe. Western sanctions against Russia and Iran have relied on the assumption that these powers would remain isolated, cut off from global markets and alternative partnerships. But if Russia and Iran can integrate their economies with resource-rich African states, they bypass that isolation entirely. Russian energy and military technology flow south. African uranium, gold, and rare earth minerals flow north and east. Iranian drone technology and asymmetric warfare expertise spread across the Sahel. And Western corporations that once dominated these markets find themselves shut out, watching as their competitors build alternative supply chains that don't depend on Western financial systems or political approval. This is where the ideological dimension becomes critical. For decades, Western powers promoted a vision of global order based on liberal democracy, free markets, and multilateral institutions. That vision is losing credibility. Across Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia, governments are openly questioning whether alignment with the West delivers tangible benefits or just perpetuates dependency and conditionality. Traore has positioned himself as a champion of this alternative worldview, one that prioritizes sovereignty over partnership and self-determination over integration into Western-led systems. If his alliance with Russia and Iran succeeds, it validates that model and encourages other leaders to follow suit. NATO's dilemma is that it cannot afford to ignore any of these theaters, but it also cannot sustain full engagement across all of them indefinitely. Military budgets are finite. Political will is fragile. Alliance cohesion weakens under prolonged strain. And every resource committed to one front is a resource unavailable elsewhere. This is the logic of strategic overstretch, and it's exactly what Russia, Iran, and their partners are counting on. But here's the uncertainty that should concern Western policymakers most. This isn't just about losing influence in specific regions. It's about losing the ability to set the terms of global competition. If hostile powers can coordinate their actions, synchronize their pressure, and offer alternative partnerships that enough countries find attractive, then the era of uncontested Western primacy is over. Not because the West was defeated militarily, but because it was outmaneuvered strategically. The question is whether NATO and its allies recognize this shift in time to adapt, or whether they're still operating under assumptions that no longer reflect the reality of global power distribution. What happens next won't just determine the outcome of conflicts in Ukraine, the Middle East, or the Sahel. It will determine whether the 21st century remains shaped by Western institutions, or whether it becomes defined by the rise of a counterorder built explicitly to challenge them.